The candle on the writing table burned low, and Elowen Ashcomb's hand trembled as she read the letter for the third time. The wax seal bore the crest of the Duke of Renwick, a stag crowned with oak leaves, and the sight of it made her stomach twist into a knot that no amount of tea could loosen. An invitation, not a polite note from a distant cousin, not a request for a charity meeting, but a formal, gold-bordered invitation to the grandest ball the county had seen in a decade. She set it down on the table as though it might burn her fingers. "You will attend," said Margaret Ashcombe, standing in the doorway with her arms folded and her chin lifted in the way she always did when she had already decided something for both of them. "There is no version of this conversation where you do not attend, Elowen. Do you understand me?" "I understand that you have already written back and accepted on my behalf," Elowen said quietly, not looking up. Margaret did not deny it. She simply walked further into the room, her skirts rustling against the old floorboards, and picked up the letter herself, turning it over as though inspecting a piece of jewelry for flaws. "The Duke of Renwick does not send invitations lightly. Half the mothers in this county have spent 5 years trying to get their daughters noticed by that man, and here he is, sending a card to a house with peeling wallpaper and a garden nobody has trimmed since spring." "Perhaps it was a mistake," Elowen offered, though she did not believe it. "It was not a mistake." Margaret's voice softened, just slightly, the way it did when she remembered that Elowen was not simply being difficult for its own sake. "Your father knew his father. There is a connection, even if it is a thin one. And thin connections are all we have left, my dear. You cannot spend the rest of your life inside this house, mourning a season that has already passed." Elowen said nothing. She rose from her chair and walked to the window, where the last gray light of the afternoon was slipping behind the hills. From here she could see the crooked fence at the edge of the property, the one Nathaniel had always meant to fix and never did, and beyond it, the empty field where he used to ride before everything changed. She did not look at that field often. She had trained herself not to. "I am not opposed to attending," she said finally, though her voice carried little conviction. "I only wonder what good it will do." "It will do the good of reminding people that you exist," Margaret said, "that you are young and clever, and not simply a name attached to old grief. You have hidden in this house for 2 years. Elowen, 2 years is enough time to grieve. It is not enough time to disappear entirely." The words landed harder than Margaret perhaps intended, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Outside, a cart rattled along the distant road, and somewhere in the house a door creaked shut on its own, the way old doors sometimes did when the wind found a way inside. "I will go," Elowen said at last, "but I will not promise to enjoy myself." Margaret allowed herself the smallest smile, the kind of smile that came from years of practice at getting her way without appearing to demand it. Enjoyment is not required, attendance is enough. That night, Elowen lay awake long after the house had gone silent, staring at the ceiling and turning the invitation over in her mind, even though she was no longer holding it in her hands. She thought of the ballroom she had not seen but could already imagine, the candles and the music, and the endless parade of eyes that would look at her and wonder who she was and why she had come. She thought of the questions people would ask, gently at first, then less gently, as the evening wore on and the wine loosened their tongues. Questions about her family, questions about the past, questions she had spent 2 years building walls to avoid. She thought too, though she did not want to, of the clock, of how at some point in every gathering there came a moment when the noise became too much, when the laughter and the music began to feel like something pressing down on her chest rather than lifting it. She had learned to watch for that moment. She had learned to leave before it arrived, quietly, without ceremony, so that no one would ask why her eyes had gone distant or why her hands had begun to shake. She did not know, lying there in the dark, that a man she had never met would soon watch for her the same way she watched for herself, only he would not know why, and the not knowing would become the thing that changed everything. The morning of the ball arrived gray and cool, with a mist that clung to the low fields and made the world look softer than it truly was. Elowen woke early, though she had slept little, and spent the day in a strange, hollow calm, the kind that came before something a person did not want to face. Margaret bustled about the house with more energy than Elowen had seen in her for months, pulling an old gown from a trunk in the attic, a deep green silk that had belonged to Elowen's mother, and declaring that with a little alteration, it would do beautifully. "It is too fine for me," Elowen said, running her fingers over the fabric. "Nonsense. It was made for a woman with your same shoulders and your same waist, and it has been waiting in that trunk for exactly this occasion." Margaret held it up against her, studying the effect with a critical eye. "Your mother would have wanted you to wear it. She always said green suited you better than anything else." Elowen did not remember her mother saying that, but she did not argue. There was little point in arguing with Margaret once her mind had settled on a course of action. And besides, some part of her, buried deep beneath the caution and the grief, felt a small flicker of something like anticipation at the thought of wearing her mother's dress to a ball she had not asked to attend. The dressmaker arrived by midday, a brisk woman named Mrs. Wren who spoke around a mouthful of pins and managed to take in the waist and adjust the sleeves in a matter of hours, muttering the whole time about how modern gowns had lost all sense of proper structure. Elowen stood still through the fittings, staring at her own reflection in the tall mirror, and barely recognizing the woman looking back at her. The green silk did something to her eyes, made them seem darker and more thoughtful, and her hair, pinned up by Margaret's careful hands, framed her face in a way she had not seen since before Nathaniel died. "There," Margaret said, stepping back to admire her work as the last pin went into place. "Now you look like a young woman going to a ball, and not a ghost haunting her own house." "I feel like both," Elowen admitted. "That is allowed," Margaret said, more gently than before. "You are allowed to feel like both, as long as you let people see the young woman tonight, even if the ghost comes with you." The carriage arrived at dusk, sent by the Duke's household as a courtesy extended to guests traveling any distance, and Elowen climbed inside with her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Margaret sat across from her, chattering about the other families who would surely be in attendance, the Carrows and the Bramwells and old Lord Pettigrew who always fell asleep in his chair by midnight, regardless of how loud the music grew, but Elowen heard only fragments of it. Her attention was fixed on the window, on the darkening countryside sliding past, on the way the trees gave way slowly to hedgerows, and then to the long stone wall that marked the edge of Renwick land. The estate itself came into view as the carriage crested a low hill, and Elowen felt her breath catch despite herself. The house was enormous, built of pale gray stone that seemed to glow faintly in the last light of evening, with row upon row of tall windows already blazing with candlelight. Carriages lined the long drive, their lamps bobbing like a string of fireflies leading toward the entrance, and even from this distance, she could hear the faint strains of an orchestra tuning its instruments. "It is larger than I imagined," she said quietly. "Everything about the Duke is larger than people imagine," Margaret replied, though there was something careful in the way she said it, as though she were repeating a rumor, rather than stating a fact she knew to be true. "He is not an easy man to know, from what I have heard. Reserved. Some say cold, though I think that is unfair. A man who inherited what he inherited at the age he inherited it is entitled to a little reserve." Elowen did not ask what Margaret meant by that. She had heard the story in fragments over the years, the way one heard most stories about people far above one's own station, filtered through gossip and softened or sharpened depending on who was telling it. The old Duke had died suddenly, and his son had taken up the title far younger than anyone expected, burdened overnight with an estate, a fortune, and the weight of expectations he had never asked to carry. It was, in its own way, a grief not unlike her own, though she doubted he would ever describe it in such terms, and she certainly would not be the one to suggest it. The carriage rolled to a stop before the great entrance, and a footman in pale livery opened the door and offered his hand to help her down. Elowen stepped out into the cool evening air, the sound of music and laughter spilling from the open doors ahead of her, and for a moment she simply stood there, gathering herself, the way she always did, before stepping into a room full of strangers. "Ready?" Margaret asked, appearing at her side. "No," Elowen said honestly. "But I am here, which will have to be enough." They climbed the wide stone steps together, past footmen, who bowed and opened doors, as though the two of them were far grander guests than they truly were, and into an entrance hall so vast and so brightly lit that Elowen had to resist the urge to stop and stare like a child. Marble floors stretched in every direction, reflecting the light of 100 candles set into gilded sconces along the walls, and a staircase curved upward on either side. wide enough that a dozen people could have descended it side by side without touching. Beyond the entrance hall, through a set of open double doors, lay the ballroom itself, and it was here that Eowyn felt the true weight of where she had come. The room seemed to stretch endlessly, its ceiling painted with clouds and figures she did not have time to study, its walls lined with mirrors that multiplied the candlelight until the whole space glowed like something out of a dream. An orchestra played from a raised platform at the far end, and already the floor was filling with couples moving through the steps of a dance, their gowns and coats a blur of color against the pale marble. Eowyn stood at the threshold for a long moment, feeling suddenly very small, very plain, and very much like a woman who had no business being in a room such as this. Margaret took her arm firmly and steered her forward before she could retreat. "Chin up," Margaret murmured. "You are an Ashcombe, and Ashcombes do not cower in doorways." Eowyn lifted her chin, though it cost her some effort, and allowed herself to be led into the glittering crowd, unaware that across the room, near the edge of the dance floor, a tall man in a dark coat had already noticed her arrival, and had already begun, without quite understanding why, to watch her. The Duke of Renwick stood near the tall windows at the far side of the ballroom, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, listening with only half his attention to a conversation between two gentlemen from London who seemed determined to discuss the price of grain, despite the orchestra, and the dancing, and the entire purpose of the evening. He had learned over the years to nod at appropriate intervals, and to let his silence be mistaken for thoughtful agreement, a skill that had served him well since he first inherited his title, far younger than he had ever expected to. His name was Alaric Whitmore, though almost no one in this room used it. To them he was the Duke, a title that had settled over him like a coat 2 sizes too large, one he had worn for so long now that he sometimes forgot what it felt like to simply be a man rather than a position. He hosted these gatherings because it was expected of him, because a duke without a ball once a season invited more gossip than one who held them regularly, but he took little pleasure in the noise and the spectacle. He preferred quiet rooms and long walks across the estate grounds, preferred the company of his horses and his books to the company of ambitious mothers parading their daughters before him, like prize livestock at a county fair. It was in the midst of this weary tolerance that he first saw her. She entered through the far doors on the arm of an older woman, and there was nothing, at first glance, that should have caught his attention. Her gown was fine but not extravagant, a deep green that suited her coloring well enough, and her manner was neither bold nor especially shy, simply composed, in a way that struck him as different from the eager, performing composure he saw in every other young woman in the room. She did not scan the crowd for important faces to be introduced to. She did not angle herself toward the most eligible corners of the room. She simply walked, with her chin lifted slightly higher than seemed natural, as though she were bracing herself against something only she could feel. Alaric found himself watching her for longer than was polite, and he had to force his attention back to the gentleman beside him, who had moved on from grain prices to the merits of a new breed of hunting dog. He nodded again, said something non-committal, and let his gaze drift back across the room without quite meaning to. She had found a seat near the edge of the floor, beside an older woman who was clearly some relation, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the dancers with an expression that was difficult to read. Not bored, exactly. Not eager, either. Something more careful than either of those, as though she were cataloging the room rather than enjoying it, filing away details for reasons of her own. "Who is the woman in green?" he asked, more to himself than to either of the men beside him, but the younger one, a baronet's son named Edmund Carow, caught the question and answered before Alaric could withdraw it. "Lady Eowyn Ashcombe," Carow said, following the Duke's gaze with obvious interest. "Her family's estate borders my father's land. Quiet sort of family. There was some tragedy a few years back, I believe, though I confess I don't recall the particulars." He paused, studying Alaric, with a faint, knowing smile. "Shall I introduce you, Your Grace?" "There is no need," Alaric said, more quickly than he intended, and turned back toward the window, as though the matter were settled. But his eyes returned to her chair within the minute, and stayed there far longer than he would have admitted to anyone in that room, drawn by something he could not name and did not yet understand, watching the still, composed figure in green as the music swelled around her, and the candles burned lower in their sconces. neither of them aware of how completely the course of the evening, and of everything that followed it, had already begun to change. The music shifted into a livelier tune, and the crowd on the dance floor rearranged itself with the practiced ease of people who had attended 100 balls exactly like this one. Eowyn watched them from her chair, the swirl of silk and candlelight blurring together into something almost hypnotic, and allowed herself, for the first time that evening, to relax slightly into the rhythm of it. Margaret had drifted off to speak with an old acquaintance, leaving Eowyn alone at the edge of the floor, and she found she did not mind the solitude nearly as much as she had expected to. "You are not dancing," a voice said beside her, and Eowyn turned to find a young woman settling into the empty chair to her left, her face bright and open, in a way that made her seem instantly familiar, though Eowyn was certain they had never met. "I have not been asked," Eowyn replied, and the honesty of it surprised her. "Then the men in this room are fools," the young woman said cheerfully, extending a gloved hand. "Lucy Bramwell. My family's land sits just past the mill pond from yours, though I doubt you'd know me. I was sent away to school for most of my growing years, and only came back to plague the county last spring." "Eowyn Ashcombe," Eowyn said, taking her hand and feeling, despite herself, the beginnings of a smile. There was something disarming about Lucy's directness, a warmth that did not seem to require anything of her in return. "I know who you are," Lucy said, not unkindly. "Everyone does. I don't mean that to sound unpleasant, only that you have a way of being spoken of with great care by people who do not actually know you at all, which I have always found rather unfair. So I thought I would come and find out for myself." Eowyn did not quite know how to respond to that, and for a moment the two of them simply sat together, watching the dancers, the silence between them oddly comfortable rather than strained. "Is it dreadful?" Lucy asked eventually, "being spoken of that way?" "It is tiring," Eowyn admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "People assume they know the shape of a thing simply because they have heard its outline. They rarely ask what is underneath." "Well, I am asking," Lucy said, turning to face her fully. "Not tonight, perhaps. Tonight is for dancing and gossip and watching old Lord Pettigrew fall asleep in his chair, which he always does by midnight without fail. But another time, if you would let me, I should like to know you properly." Something in Eowyn's chest loosened slightly at the offer, a small and unexpected warmth that she had not felt in a long while. "I would like that," she said, and found that she meant it. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young man Eowyn did not recognize, tall and fair-haired, with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted his welcome in any room he entered. He bowed to both of them with a flourish that seemed slightly too practiced. "Miss Bramwell, Lady Ashcombe," he straightened, his eyes settling on Eowyn with an interest that made her slightly uneasy. "Edmund Carow, at your service. I do not believe we have been properly introduced, though I have certainly heard your name mentioned." "So I am told," Eowyn said, a note of dry humor creeping into her voice despite herself. Edmund laughed, apparently delighted by the response. "Might I have the honor of this dance, Lady Ashcombe? I promise I am considerably better company on the floor than I am standing still making introductions." Eowyn hesitated, glancing briefly toward Lucy, who gave her the smallest encouraging nod, and then rose from her chair, allowing Edmund to lead her toward the edge of the dancing crowd. The orchestra had begun a slower piece, and she found the steps came back to her more easily than she expected, her body remembering rhythms her mind had almost convinced itself it had forgotten. "You dance well," Edmund said as they moved through the pattern of the set. "Better than most who claim to have been away from society for some time." "I did not realize my absence from society was common knowledge," Eowyn said, keeping her tone light, though the comment landed with more weight than he likely intended. "The county is small," Edmund said, with an easy shrug that suggested he saw nothing troubling in the observation. "News travels whether one wishes it to or not. I only meant it as a compliment, Lady Ashcombe. You have clearly not forgotten how to move through a room, whatever else you may have forgotten." She did not answer that, choosing instead to focus on the steps of the dance, and if Edmund noticed her silence, he did not remark upon it, filling the space instead with an easy stream of conversation about the other guests, the quality of the orchestra, and his own recent trip to London, none of which required much response from her at all. She found she preferred it that way. It was easier to smile and nod along to a conversation that asks nothing of her than to face questions she had no wish to answer. When the dance ended, Edmund escorted her back toward her chair, with a bow and a promise to seek her out again later in the evening, and Eowyn sank back into her seat with the particular exhaustion that came from performing ease she did not entirely feel. Lucy was still there, watching her with an expression of open curiosity. "Well?" Lucy asked. "What did you make of him?" "Pleasant enough," Eowyn said carefully, "though I suspect he is more interested in being seen dancing with the mysterious Ashcombe girl than in the girl herself." Lucy laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that turned a few heads nearby. "That is likely true of half the men in this room, if I am honest. Mysteries are far more interesting from a distance. It is the reason so few people bother to ask real questions." She paused, studying Eowyn for a moment before adding, more gently, "I do not count myself among them, for what it is worth." "I know," Eowyn said, and found that she believed it. Across the room, near the tall windows, Alaric had watched the entire exchange, with an attention he told himself was simply idle curiosity, though the tightness in his jaw, when Caro led Eowyn onto the dance floor, suggested something more complicated than curiosity alone. He was aware, distantly, that his companions had continued talking beside him, something about the coming hunting season, and a new mare one of them had acquired, but their words slid past him without leaving any impression. "You are staring again, Your Grace," Caro's friend observed, having rejoined the group after his own turn on the dance floor with someone else entirely. "At the Ashcombe girl, if I am not mistaken." "I am not staring," Alaric said, with more force than the accusation warranted, and turned deliberately toward the window, though his reflection in the glass still gave him a clear enough view of the dance floor behind him. He did not understand it himself, this strange, persistent pull toward a woman he had exchanged no words with, whose name he had learned only an hour before. He had met 100 young women exactly like her, or so he told himself, all of them poised and pretty, and eager to catch the eye of a duke, and none of them had ever held his attention for longer than the polite minimum required by manners. There was nothing, on the surface, that should have set Eowyn Ashcombe apart from any of them. And yet, there was something in the way she held herself, a kind of careful containment that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the way he had learned to hold himself in the years since his father's death, when grief and duty had arrived together, and left no room for anything as simple as ordinary feeling. He recognized it, the way one recognized a language once spoken fluently, and now only half remembered. He wondered what she was containing, and found that the wondering would not leave him alone. "Your Grace," came a voice at his elbow, and he turned to find his estate steward, Gideon Hartley, standing there, with the slightly harried expression he always wore during large gatherings. "The wine merchant has arrived at the servants' entrance, in some confusion about tomorrow's delivery. I hate to trouble you during the ball, but he insists the matter cannot wait until morning." Alaric suppressed a sigh. "Handle it as you see fit, Hartley. I trust your judgment more than my own on such matters." "Very good, Your Grace." Hartley hesitated, glancing briefly across the room toward the dance floor, before adding, with the careful diplomacy of a man who had served the family long enough to speak more freely than most, "Though if I may say, you seem rather more distracted this evening than the wine merchant's troubles alone would explain." "You may not say," Alaric replied, though there was no real heat in it, and Hartley withdrew, with the faint, knowing smile of a man who intended to say it anyway, simply not aloud. Left alone once more, Alaric allowed himself a longer look across the room, and found Eowyn's chair once again occupied only by herself and the bright young woman beside her, the fair-haired suitor, having moved on to seek out another partner for the next set. She was not dancing again yet. She sat with her hands folded, watching the room with that same careful, cataloging gaze he had noticed before, and for a moment, as though she felt the weight of his attention, her eyes lifted and met his across the crowded floor. The moment held for only a second, perhaps two, before she looked away again, but in that brief exchange, Alaric felt something shift inside his chest, unfamiliar and unsettling, like a door he had not realized was locked, suddenly finding itself ajar. He did not know what to make of it. He only knew that he wanted, quite badly and quite suddenly, to cross the room and speak with her, to hear her voice and learn what lay beneath the careful composure she wore like armor. He did not move immediately. Years of restraint were not so easily undone by a single glance, however unsettling. But he found himself watching the clock on the far wall with new attention, calculating, without quite admitting to himself why, how much of the evening remained before the moment might present itself naturally, a reason to approach her that would not seem too eager, too transparent, too much like exactly what it was. The orchestra began a new piece, and the dancers reassembled themselves on the floor, and across the vast, glittering room, two people who had exchanged no words at all found themselves thinking of each other with an intensity neither fully understood, while the candles burned steadily lower, and the night moved, unhurried and unaware, toward the hour that would change everything between them. It was nearly an hour later when the Duke finally found his opportunity, and even then, it arrived not through any careful plan of his own, but through the ordinary chaos of a crowded ballroom, when Lord Pettigrew's grandson, attempting an ambitious turn in the dance, collided with a passing footman and sent a tray of glasses crashing to the marble floor. The noise drew every eye in the room, and in the small commotion that followed, Eowyn rose from her chair to help gather the scattered fragments of glass, an instinct born more of habit than necessity, since the footmen were already moving quickly to clear the mess themselves. Alaric found himself moving, before he had fully decided to, crossing the room with a purposefulness that surprised even him, and arrived at her side just as she straightened from where she had crouched to help. "There is no need for that, Lady Ashcombe," he said, and watched her turn toward him with an expression that flickered briefly, unmistakably, with surprise. "The staff are well practiced at managing such small disasters." "Old habits," she said, recovering quickly, though a faint color had risen in her cheeks. "My mother always said a guest who helps clean up after a mishap is remembered more fondly than one who steps over the mess and continues talking. Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Eowyn said, and something in the simple past tense of it made Alaric wish, immediately and uselessly, that he had chosen his words more carefully. "Forgive me," he said. "I did not mean to touch on anything painful." "You did not," she said, though the small tightness around her eyes suggested otherwise, quickly smoothed away as she composed herself again. "It has been some years now. One learns to speak of the dead without flinching, eventually, or at least to appear as though one has." Alaric considered this for a moment, struck by the honesty of it, the way she had offered him a true thing, rather than the polite deflection most people would have reached for instead. "I find that a difficult skill myself," he admitted. "My father died 4 years ago, and I have not yet managed to speak of him without a certain flinching, appearances notwithstanding." Something shifted in her expression then, a kind of recognition passing between them that required no further explanation. The particular understanding shared by two people who had each learned, separately and in their own private ways, how grief reshaped a person from the inside, without ever announcing itself on the outside. "I did not realize," she said quietly. "I am sorry. As am I, for your loss, whatever it was," he said, and did not push further, sensing correctly that she was not yet ready to name it, and respecting, more than he expected to, her right to keep it unnamed for as long as she wished. They stood together for a moment in a silence that felt, oddly, less awkward than companionable, the noise of the ballroom continuing around them, distant and unimportant. It was Alaric who broke it first, extending his hand with a formality that felt, even to him, slightly performative, given the conversation that had just passed between them. "Might I have this dance, Lady Ashcombe? I confess I have been meaning to ask since you arrived, though it has taken me an embarrassingly long time to find the courage." Eowyn looked at his offered hand for a long moment, and Alaric found himself holding his breath in a way that struck him as faintly ridiculous for a man of his position, waiting on the decision of a woman he had known for less than 5 minutes. "I would like that," she said finally, and placed her hand in his. The orchestra had begun a slower piece, one that required less intricate footwork and more simple, steady movement, and Alaric found himself grateful for it, since his attention was entirely occupied by the woman across from him, rather than the steps beneath his feet. She danced well, as Caro had noted earlier, but there was something more than skill in the way she moved, a kind of deliberate presence, as though she had decided, for this dance at least, to fully inhabit the moment, rather than simply endure it. "You seem different from the way you appeared across the room," he said, as they moved through the pattern of the dance. "How do you mean?" "Watchful," he said, choosing the word carefully. "As though you were cataloging everyone, rather than enjoying yourself. I noticed it before I knew your name." Elowen's steps did not falter, but something in her expression grew more guarded. "You noticed a great deal, for a man who claims to have taken an embarrassingly long time to approach me." "I am capable of noticing and hesitating simultaneously," he said, and was rewarded with the faintest ghost of a smile. "It is one of my more frustrating qualities, according to my steward." "Your steward sounds like an honest man. Alarmingly so at times." He turned her gently through the next step of the dance, close enough now that he could see the small details he had missed from across the room. The faint scattering of freckles across her nose. The way her eyes were not simply dark, but held flecks of amber near the center, visible only this close. "May I ask what it is you were cataloging, watching the room the way you did?" She was quiet for a moment, considering the question, and he thought perhaps she would deflect it, as she had deflected Caro's earlier comment about her absence from society. But when she spoke, her voice was low and careful, offering him something true. "Exits," she said simply. "I was noting the exits. It is a habit I have not managed to break." "From what?" "From rooms that grow too loud," she said, and though she did not elaborate further, Alaric sensed that this, too, was a true thing, offered carefully, a small piece of herself set down between them, like a fragile object handed across a narrow bridge. "I understand that more than you might expect," he said, and meant it, thinking of the countless evenings in the years since his father's death, when he had stood in rooms exactly like this one, surrounded by noise and light and expectation, feeling as though the walls were closing in around him despite the vast open space, counting the minutes until he could reasonably withdraw without offending anyone. "Do you?" She looked at him more directly then, something searching in her gaze, as though testing whether the claim was sincere or merely the polite sympathy men of his station often performed without truly feeling. "I do," he said, holding her gaze steadily, "though I suspect our reasons differ." "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps grief simply wears the same coat, regardless of what shape it takes underneath." The dance drew to its close, and they came to a stop facing each other, both slightly out of breath, though the steps had not been especially demanding, the exertion belonging more to the conversation than the movement. Alaric bowed, and Elowen curtsied, and for a moment, neither of them moved to step away, caught in the strange gravity that had settled between them over the course of a single dance. "Thank you, Lady Ashcombe," he said finally, "for the dance, and for the honesty. Both are rarer gifts than people realize." "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, "for asking, and for not pressing further than I was prepared to give." He escorted her back toward her chair, where Lucy waited with an expression of poorly concealed delight, clearly having witnessed enough of the dance to draw her own conclusions about what it meant. Alaric bowed once more, and withdrew, forcing himself not to look back as he crossed the room, though the effort of not looking back cost him more discipline than he cared to admit. "Well," Lucy said, the moment he was out of earshot, leaning close with barely contained excitement. "That did not look like an ordinary dance, Elowen Ashcombe. That looked like something else entirely." "It was only a dance," Elowen said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction, and the faint flush, still visible on her cheeks, told a different story than her words. "If you say so," Lucy said, clearly unconvinced, but she let the matter drop, sensing correctly that Elowen needed a moment to gather herself, rather than to defend or explain what had just happened. Elowen sat quietly for a while after that, watching the dancers without truly seeing them, replaying the conversation in her mind, and finding herself troubled by how easily the truth had slipped from her, how she had told a duke she had known for mere minutes, something she had not admitted aloud to Margaret in 2 years. There was something dangerous in that ease, she thought, something that required careful handling before it grew into more than she was prepared to manage. She glanced across the room and found him already watching her again, though this time he did not look away when their eyes met, and the steadiness of his gaze sent a small, unfamiliar warmth through her chest that she was not entirely sure she wanted to feel. The clock on the far wall read 9:30, and she found herself, for the first time that evening, wishing that time might slow, rather than hurry, toward the moment she knew was coming. The remainder of the hour passed for Alaric in a strange, unfamiliar state of divided attention, his body moving through the expected motions of a host, while his mind kept returning, again and again, to the woman in the green gown, seated near the edge of the floor. He greeted guests he had known for years, and found himself forgetting their names almost as soon as they were spoken. He accepted compliments on the quality of the orchestra without registering a word of the music. He nodded along to a lengthy complaint from Lady Pettigrew about the state of the roads leading to the estate, and only realized afterward that he had agreed to something he had no intention of doing. "You are not yourself tonight, Your Grace," Hartley observed, appearing again at his elbow during a rare lull in the receiving line. "I have never known you to lose track of a conversation so thoroughly. Lady Pettigrew will expect a full survey of the Eastern Road by week's end, and I do not believe you were listening closely enough to know that is what you promised her." "Was I not listening?" Alaric asked, though the admission was unnecessary, since they both knew the answer already. "You were watching the Ashcombe girl," Hartley said, with the particular bluntness he reserved for moments when he judged that honesty would serve his employer better than deference. "As you have been for the better part of an hour, if I am not mistaken." Alaric did not bother denying it this time. "Is it so obvious?" "To anyone paying attention, Your Grace, which admittedly is not everyone in this room. Most are too occupied with their own performances to notice yours." Hartley's expression softened slightly. "For what it is worth, I have not seen you look at anyone the way you looked at her during that dance. Not in the 4 years I have served this household." The observation settled uncomfortably in Alaric's chest, not because it was unwelcome, but because it named something he had not yet allowed himself to fully acknowledge, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. He was not a man given to sudden attachments. He had spent the years since his father's death building careful distances between himself and anyone who might ask more of him than he was prepared to give, and the ease with which those distances had collapsed in the space of a single dance troubled him nearly as much as it intrigued him. "I know very little about her," he said, more to himself than to Hartley. "Then perhaps you ought to learn," Hartley said simply, and excused himself to attend to some matter of the evening's arrangements, leaving Alaric alone with the thought. He glanced across the room again, and found Elowen still seated beside her friend, the two of them deep in some conversation he could not hear, occasionally laughing in a way that transformed her entire face, softening the careful watchfulness he had noticed earlier into something brighter and more unguarded. He found himself wondering what it would take to see that expression directed at him, and immediately chided himself for the thought, aware of how quickly and how foolishly he had allowed his composure to slip. He did not approach her again immediately, mindful of appearing too eager, though every instinct urged him otherwise. Instead, he busied himself with the duties of a host, moving through the room, exchanging pleasantries, accepting introductions to daughters and nieces paraded before him with barely concealed hope, all the while tracking, at the edge of his awareness, the position of a particular green gown across the crowded floor. It was during one such circuit of the room, perhaps 40 minutes later, that he noticed something had changed in her posture. She had returned to her seat after another dance, this time with a gentleman Alaric did not recognize, and something about the way she held herself now seemed different from before. The composure drawn tighter, her hands folded a little too carefully in her lap, her gaze fixed on some point across the room that did not seem to be looking at anything in particular. He excused himself from the conversation he had been half participating in, and made his way toward her, though he stopped short of approaching directly, sensing instinctively that whatever had shifted in her required space rather than attention. He positioned himself instead near a nearby pillar, close enough to observe without being obvious about it, and watched as her friend Lucy leaned toward her, saying something quiet, to which Elowen shook her head and offered a small, unconvincing smile in return. The clock on the far wall read 10:15. Alaric did not know, could not have known, what significance that particular hour held for the woman across the room, but something in his instincts, honed by years of watching his own carefully guarded emotions for the first signs of strain, recognized the shift happening in her now. He had seen that particular kind of stillness before, in his own reflection, in the moments before he needed to excuse himself from a gathering that had grown too loud, too bright, too full of expectation he could no longer meet. He wanted, quite suddenly, and quite urgently, to go to her, to ask what was wrong, to offer whatever comfort a near stranger could reasonably offer. But he held himself back, aware that such an approach, however well-intentioned, might feel like an intrusion rather than a kindness. And instead he continued to watch, unable to look away, as the minute hand crept steadily toward the top of the hour. Lucy said something else to her, and this time Eowyn answered more fully, though Alaric could not hear the words from this distance. Whatever she said seemed to satisfy Lucy for the moment, and the conversation between them shifted to something lighter, the two of them turning their attention back toward the dance floor. But Eowyn's eyes, Alaric noticed, kept drifting, almost involuntarily, toward the tall clock mounted on the far wall, and each time they did, something in her shoulders seemed to tighten a fraction more. He thought of approaching her again, of asking her for another dance simply to give her something else to focus on, a distraction from whatever was building inside her. But before he could act on the thought, Lord Pettigrew's booming voice called for his attention from across the room, some matter concerning the arrangement of a hunting party for the following week, and Alaric found himself pulled away, unable to refuse a conversation with a man of Pettigrew's standing, without causing exactly the kind of talk he had spent the evening trying to avoid. The conversation stretched longer than he wanted it to, Pettigrew's enthusiasm for the details of the hunt showing no signs of flagging, and by the time Alaric finally managed to extract himself, offering some excuse about checking on the refreshments, nearly 10 minutes had passed. He turned immediately back toward the spot where Eowyn had been sitting, a strange urgency in his chest that he did not entirely understand, as though some part of him already sensed what he would find. Her chair was empty. Lucy remained seated beside it, looking around the room with a slightly puzzled expression, and as Alaric watched, she rose and glanced toward the entrance hall, then back toward the dance floor, then toward the retiring room set aside for the ladies, her search growing visibly more concerned with each passing moment. Alaric felt something tighten in his chest, an unfamiliar, unwelcome sensation that he recognized, uncomfortably, as concern for a woman he had known for scarcely 2 hours. He made his way toward Lucy, weaving between clusters of guests, who seemed determined to catch his attention, at exactly the moment he least wanted to be caught, and arrived at the empty chair, with a question already forming on his lips. "Miss Bramwell," he said, and Lucy turned toward him, her expression a mixture of surprise at being addressed directly by the Duke, and continued distraction with her search. "Forgive the intrusion, but I could not help noticing. Lady Ashcombe seems to have left her seat." "She excused herself only a few minutes ago," Lucy said, though something in her tone suggested uncertainty rather than confidence. "She said she needed some air, that the room had grown too warm. I offered to accompany her, but she insisted she would return shortly." She glanced again toward the far doors, a small frown creasing her forehead. "It has been longer than a few minutes now, I think." "Has this happened before?" Alaric asked, the question leaving him before he had fully considered whether it was his place to ask it. Lucy hesitated, and in that hesitation, Alaric read the answer clearly enough. "I do not know her well enough to say for certain, Your Grace. We only met properly tonight. But I confess I have heard, in passing, that she does not often stay for the full length of an evening's entertainments." She paused, studying him with a sudden, sharpened curiosity. "Why do you ask?" Alaric did not answer immediately, his attention already drifting toward the tall entrance doors that led out onto the terrace, and, beyond it, the gardens that stretched down toward the drive where the carriages waited. Something in him, some instinct he could not fully articulate, told him that the question mattered more than he was prepared to explain, and that the answer, whatever it turned out to be, would not be a simple one. "No particular reason," he said finally, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Only concern for a guest, Miss Bramwell." Nothing more. But even as he said it, he was already moving toward the doors, his pace quickening with each step, driven by an urgency that had no clear source and no clear justification. Only the growing certainty that something important was slipping away from him with every passing minute, and that he could not simply stand by and let it go. The night air outside was cool and sharp compared to the warmth of the crowded ballroom, and Alaric paused on the terrace for a moment, scanning the darkened garden below for any sign of her. Torches lined the stone pathways at intervals, their light not quite reaching into the deeper shadows beneath the trees, and beyond the formal garden, the land fell away toward the drive, where a handful of carriages still waited for their owners, the drivers gathered in small clusters, sharing pipes and quiet conversation while they waited. He descended the terrace steps quickly, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer light, and made his way along the nearest path, uncertain what exactly he was searching for, or what he intended to say if he found her. He only knew that the empty chair had left something unsettled in him, a feeling he associated, uncomfortably, with the moment he had learned of his father's sudden collapse, the same cold, urgent dread that something important was happening just beyond his reach. He found her near the far edge of the garden, standing beside a low stone wall that marked the boundary between the cultivated grounds and the wilder parkland beyond, her back to the house, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She had not brought a wrap, he noticed, and the green silk of her gown looked thin and insufficient against the night air. "Lady Ashcombe," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her, though she turned at the sound of his voice with a sharpness that suggested he had startled her regardless. "Your Grace," she said, and he heard, beneath the careful politeness of her tone, something unsteady, a tightness that had not been there during their dance. "I did not mean to worry anyone. I only needed a moment away from the noise." "You need not explain yourself to me," he said, moving closer, but stopping a respectful distance away, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to leave her room. "I am well," she said, though the words came too quickly, too automatically, the reflexive answer of someone long practiced at reassuring others, regardless of the truth beneath it. Alaric studied her for a long moment, the torchlight catching the pale line of her face, the careful set of her jaw, and found himself unwilling to accept the easy answer she had offered. "Forgive me if I overstep," he said carefully, "but you do not appear entirely well, Lady Ashcombe, and I confess I have some small experience recognizing the particular look of a person who has convinced themselves that appearing well is the same as being well." Something in her expression cracked slightly at that, a fissure in the careful composure she had maintained all evening, and for a moment he thought she might simply turn and walk further into the darkness, away from him, and away from whatever truth his words had come too close to touching. But she did not move. She stood very still, her arms still wrapped around herself, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness. "It is a particular hour," she said quietly, "one I have learned to be careful of, at gatherings such as this." 10 o'clock, Alaric said, remembering the clock, remembering the way her eyes had kept drifting toward it in the minutes before she disappeared. She looked at him with something like surprise, as though she had not expected him to have noticed such a small, specific detail. "Yes," she said, 10 o'clock. "May I ask why?" For a long moment she said nothing, and Alaric feared he had pressed too far, had asked for more than she was prepared to give a man she had known for only a few hours, however honest their earlier conversation had felt. He was on the verge of withdrawing the question, of offering to simply escort her back inside without further explanation, when she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "My brother died 2 years ago," she said, "at 10:15 in the evening. I was not with him when it happened. I had been sent from the room, told it was not a sight for a young woman to witness, and I sat in the hallway outside, listening to the clock in the parlor mark the minutes, until someone finally came to tell me it was over." She paused, her breath visibly unsteady now, though her voice remained low and controlled, the careful control of someone who had told this story to herself many times in the privacy of her own mind, but never aloud to another person. "Every gathering I attend, every ballroom, every dinner party, the same hour arrives, and I find I cannot bear to be surrounded by noise and laughter when it does. It feels, in some way I cannot entirely explain, like a betrayal of him, to be enjoying myself at the exact moment the world took him from me." Alaric felt something shift heavily in his chest, a weight settling there that he recognized, with startling clarity, as his own grief reaching out to meet hers. Two separate sorrows finding an unexpected kinship in the darkness of a garden neither of them had planned to stand in together. "I am so sorry," he said, and the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, though he could think of nothing better to offer. "You need not apologize," she said. "It is not your grief to carry." "No," he agreed. "But I understand, more than you might expect, what it is to feel that grief arrive uninvited, in the middle of a room full of people who have no idea it is happening at all." He hesitated, then continued, more quietly. "My father died on a night much like this one. Not at a ball, but at a dinner I had insisted on hosting despite his failing health, certain he would recover, as he always had before. I was in the next room, laughing at some joke a guest had made, when a servant came to tell me he had stopped breathing. I have never quite managed to laugh freely at a dinner party since, though I have become very skilled at appearing as though I have. Eowyn looked at him then, with an expression he had not seen from her before, something raw and searching, as though she were reassessing everything she had assumed about the composed, dutiful Duke, who had asked her to dance earlier that evening. "I did not expect you to understand," she admitted. "Most people, when I have allowed myself to say even a small part of this, respond with sympathy that feels more like discomfort than understanding. They want the conversation to end quickly, so the sadness does not linger." "I am not most people," Alaric said, and though the words might have sounded arrogant from another man, from him they carried only a quiet, weary honesty. "Or perhaps I am simply another person, who has learned the same lesson you have, that grief does not observe convenient hours, and that pretending otherwise costs more than most people realize." They stood together in silence for a while after that, the sounds of the ball drifting faintly from the house behind them, muffled and distant, as though it belonged to some other world entirely. Eowyn's arms had loosened slightly from around herself, and Alaric, noticing the cold that still clung to the night air, shrugged out of his coat without a word and offered it to her.
"You need not,"
she began, but he had already draped it over her shoulders, and she did not resist further, pulling it closer around herself with an expression of quiet gratitude. "Would you rather return to the ball," he asked, "or would you prefer to remain out here a while longer? I confess I find myself in no particular hurry to return to the noise myself, if you would allow me to stay and keep you company." Eowyn considered the question for a long moment, studying him in the torchlight with an expression he could not fully read, something between caution and the beginnings of trust. "I would like that," she said finally, "if you do not mind missing your own ball, Your Grace." "The ball will manage without its host, for a little while longer," he said, and something in the small, private smile that followed felt more real, more unguarded, than anything he had offered anyone in the crowded room behind them. "Besides, I find I am considerably more interested in this conversation than in another discussion of grain prices or hunting dogs." Eowyn's answering smile was small but genuine, the first fully unguarded expression he had seen from her all evening, and something about it settled into his chest with a warmth that felt, in that moment, more valuable than anything the grand ballroom behind them had to offer. They remained in the garden together as the minutes passed, the dreaded hour slipping by unnoticed between them, replaced by something quieter and more honest than either of them had expected to find that night. While inside the great house, the music played on, unaware that its host had found, in the shadows of his own garden, something far more important than the celebration he had spent so much effort arranging. They talked for nearly half an hour in the quiet of the garden, the conversation drifting from grief into gentler territory, memories of childhood, small observations about the strange rituals of society they had both been raised to perform without ever quite believing in them. Eowyn found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, surprised each time by the sound of her own laughter, as though it belonged to someone she had not been in a long while. Alaric watched her with an attention that felt, to her, entirely different from the polite interest of the other men who had approached her that evening, less concerned with what she might offer him, and more simply curious about who she was. Eventually, mindful of Margaret's certain worry and the impropriety of remaining alone with a man for so long, however innocent their conversation had been, Eowyn suggested they return inside. Alaric agreed, though something in his expression suggested reluctance, and as they walked back along the torchlit path toward the terrace, he found himself searching for some way to extend the evening further, some excuse to ensure their conversation would not simply end at the ballroom doors. "Might I call on you?" he asked, as they reached the base of the terrace steps. "At Ashcombe House, once a suitable interval has passed? I would like very much to continue this conversation, if you would permit it." Eowyn hesitated, and Alaric felt a flicker of anxiety at the pause, uncertain whether he had misjudged the closeness that had grown between them in the garden. But when she answered, her voice carried the same careful honesty she had offered him all evening. "I would like that," she said, "though I must warn you, Your Grace, that Ashcombe House offers far less grandeur than Renwick. You would find our gardens considerably less impressive, and our orchestra consists entirely of my aunt's off-key humming while she works in the kitchen." Alaric laughed, a genuine sound that surprised him with its ease, and something in Elowen's expression softened further at the sound of it, as though she had not expected to be the cause of his laughter, and found she liked it more than she anticipated. "I have had quite enough grandeur for one evening," he said. "I think I should manage the humming quite well." They climbed the terrace steps together and returned to the ballroom, where Margaret was waiting, with an expression of poorly concealed anxiety that dissolved into surprise, and then something more calculating, when she saw who had escorted her niece back inside. Alaric bowed to both women, offered his excuses to attend to his other guests, and withdrew, though his eyes lingered on Elowen for a moment longer than strict propriety allowed. "What was that about?" Margaret asked, the moment he was out of earshot, her eyes bright with a curiosity she made no effort to hide. "Nothing of consequence," Elowen said, though the small, unfamiliar warmth still lingering in her chest suggested otherwise, and Margaret, studying her niece's face with the sharp attention of a woman who had raised her from childhood, said nothing further, though her expression made clear she did not believe the claim for a moment. The remainder of the evening passed more easily than Elowen had expected, the dreaded hour behind her now, the weight in her chest lightened, if not fully lifted, by the conversation in the garden. She danced twice more, once with Edmund Caro again, whose attentions she now found considerably less interesting than before, and once with an elderly gentleman who spent the entire dance discussing his grandchildren with an enthusiasm that required little response from her at all. Throughout it, she remained aware, at the edge of her attention, of the Duke's presence across the room, catching his eye occasionally, exchanging small, private smiles that felt like a secret shared between them in the midst of a crowd that noticed nothing. But as the evening wore on, and the hour grew later, Elowen felt the old restlessness begin to creep back in, not tied to grief this time but to something more practical, the growing exhaustion of a woman unused to so much sustained attention, so much noise and effort and performance. Margaret found her near midnight, sitting once again near the edge of the floor, and studied her with a knowing eye. "You are tired," Margaret observed. "Shall I call for the carriage?" Elowen glanced across the room, searching for Alaric among the thinning crowd, wanting to say goodbye properly, to thank him again for the kindness of the garden and the promise of his visit. But he was engaged in conversation with a cluster of older gentlemen near the far windows, deep in some discussion that seemed unlikely to end quickly, and Elowen found herself reluctant to interrupt, reluctant, too, to draw further attention to whatever had passed between them that evening, mindful of how quickly such attention could turn into speculation and gossip that neither of them had asked for. "Yes," she said finally. "Let us go." She did not seek him out to say goodbye. It was not, she told herself, as the carriage carried her and Margaret away from the glowing windows of Renwick House, out of unkindness or forgetfulness, but simply the old habit reasserting itself, the practiced instinct to leave quietly, without ceremony, before anyone could ask too many questions about why she was going, or press her to stay longer than she wished. She had done it 100 times before, at gatherings far less significant than this one, and it had never before felt like anything worth troubling over. It was only as the carriage rolled down the long drive, the lights of Renwick House shrinking behind them into the darkness, that a small, uncomfortable feeling settled into her chest, a suspicion that this particular quiet departure might mean something different than all the others that had come before it. Inside the ballroom, Alaric extracted himself from the lingering conversation as soon as he reasonably could, and made his way back toward the spot where he had left Elowen, eager to say goodnight properly, perhaps to confirm the timing of his promised visit, perhaps simply to see her smile once more before the evening ended. But the chair where she had been sitting was empty again, and this time there was no Lucy Bramwell beside it to explain where she had gone. He searched the room quickly, his earlier calm giving way to a familiar, unwelcome urgency, but a brief inquiry to a nearby footman confirmed what some instinct had already told him. Lady Ashcomb's carriage had departed several minutes before, the footman said, apologizing for not having thought to inform him sooner. Alaric stood very still amid the thinning crowd, the music still playing somewhere behind him, the candles burning lower in their sconces, and felt something strange and unfamiliar settle over him, a disappointment far heavier than the situation seemed to warrant. She had left without a word. After everything they had shared in the garden, After the promise he had made to call on her, after the small, private smiles exchanged across the crowded room, she had simply vanished into the night, as though none of it had happened at all. He told himself it meant nothing, that she had likely grown tired, that Margaret had likely insisted on an early departure, that there were a dozen ordinary explanations that had nothing to do with him or with anything he might have said or done wrong. But the empty chair troubled him regardless, more than he could explain, more than seemed reasonable for a man who had known the woman for only a handful of hours. He found Hartley near the entrance, overseeing the departure of the remaining guests, and pulled him aside with a question that felt, even as he asked it, slightly foolish. "Lady Ashcomb's family," he said. "Ashcombe House. Do you know it?" "I know of it, Your Grace," Hartley said, studying his employer with a curiosity he was too well trained to voice directly. "A modest estate, some distance to the north. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," Alaric said, echoing his earlier evasion to Lucy, though this time the words felt even less convincing than before. He glanced once more toward the door, through which she had disappeared, and something settled in his chest, quiet but certain, a resolve that had not been there an hour earlier. "I find I would like to know a great deal more about it, Hartley, and about the family who lives there." Hartley did not press further, though the small, knowing smile that crossed his face as he withdrew suggested he understood perfectly well what had happened that evening, even if his employer was not yet ready to name it aloud himself. The ball continued around them, winding down slowly toward its close, but for the Duke of Renwick, standing alone near the entrance hall, with an empty chair and an unanswered question weighing on his mind, the evening had already ended the moment the green silk gown disappeared into the darkness beyond his reach. The days that followed the ball passed slowly for Eowyn, marked by an unfamiliar restlessness that she could not quite explain to herself, let alone to Margaret, who watched her with increasing interest over the following week. She found herself returning, again and again, to the memory of the garden, the low stone wall, the weight of his coat around her shoulders, the quiet understanding in his voice when she had told him about Nathaniel. She had not expected to find such a thing at a ball she had not wanted to attend, and the unexpectedness of it left her uncertain how to hold it. "You have been distracted all week," Margaret observed one afternoon, as they sat together in the small parlor, Eowyn's needlework lying forgotten in her lap, while she stared out the window at the overgrown garden beyond. "Distracted in a way I have not seen from you in a very long time." "I do not know what you mean," Eowyn said, though the denial lacked any real conviction. "I mean," Margaret said, setting down her own work with the deliberate patience of a woman preparing to say something important, "that you have not once mentioned Nathaniel this week, not even in passing, which is more unusual than you perhaps realize. And you have twice now walked past the front window at exactly the hour the post arrives, as though you were expecting something." Eowyn felt her cheeks warm, caught out by an observation she had not realized she was making so obvious. "I am not expecting anything," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she found herself glancing again toward the window, toward the empty drive beyond it. "The Duke of Renwick asked to call on you," Margaret said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, one she had clearly suspected for some days, and was only now voicing aloud. "That is what happened in the garden that night, is it not? That is why you came back inside, looking as though you had seen something you did not expect to see." Eowyn did not answer immediately, torn between the instinct to deflect, as she had deflected every question about her feelings for 2 years, and a newer, less familiar instinct to simply admit the truth to the one person who had always, despite her occasional sharpness, been on her side. She chose, finally, the truth. "He did," she admitted, "though I do not know if he meant it, or if it was simply the kind of thing said in the warmth of a particular evening, forgotten by morning. Dukes do not generally make promises of that nature carelessly," Margaret said. "There is too much risk of gossip attached to such things for a man of his position to offer them without meaning them." "Perhaps," Eowyn said, though she could not fully believe it. Some part of her still braced for disappointment, the old habit of expecting loss rather than trusting in good fortune. It was nearly a fortnight after the ball, longer than Eowyn had expected, longer than she had wanted to admit she was counting, when a letter finally arrived, sealed with the same stag-crowned crest that had first announced the invitation. Eowyn's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, and Margaret, pretending to busy herself with some task nearby, while clearly straining to hear every word, watched with barely concealed anticipation as Elowen read the contents. The letter was brief, formal in the way such correspondence was expected to be, but beneath the careful phrasing, Elowen sensed something warmer, something that felt distinctly like the man she had spoken with in the garden, rather than the distant, dutiful Duke everyone else in the county seemed to know. He wrote that he had been detained by estate matters longer than he had hoped, that he apologized for the delay, and that he would very much like to call on Ashcombe House the following Thursday, if such a visit would be welcome. "Well?" Margaret asked, unable to contain herself any longer. "He is coming Thursday," Elowen said, and found, to her own surprise, that her voice carried more happiness than caution, a shift she had not expected to happen so quickly. Meanwhile, at Renwick House, Alaric had spent the fortnight in a state of quiet, private turmoil that none of his usual duties had managed to fully distract him from. He had told himself, in the days immediately following the ball, that he would wait a reasonable interval before writing, that appearing too eager would seem unbecoming, that there were proper forms to be observed in matters such as this. But the reasonable interval had stretched longer than intended, first because of an unexpected dispute among his tenant farmers that required his personal attention, and later, if he was honest with himself, because some small, cautious part of him feared that a letter sent too quickly might be met with the same quiet retreat he had witnessed at the end of the ball. "You have read that letter 3 times already, Your Grace," Hartley observed one evening, finding Alaric at his desk, with Elowen's brief reply held in his hands, her handwriting neat and careful, confirming that Thursday would suit her well, and that she looked forward to his visit. "It is a short letter," Alaric said, by way of explanation, though the small smile he could not quite suppress suggested he found nothing lacking in its brevity. "Short letters can carry a great deal, when written by the right hand," Hartley said, with the particular wisdom of a man who had watched his employer navigate 4 years of careful, guarded solitude, and who recognized, perhaps better than Alaric himself, how significant this small crack in that solitude truly was. "I take it the visit to Ashcombe House is settled then?" "Thursday," Alaric confirmed, folding the letter carefully and setting it aside, though his eyes lingered on it a moment longer than necessary. "I find myself more nervous about it than I have been about matters of considerably greater consequence, Hartley. I confess I do not entirely understand why." "I suspect you understand perfectly well, Your Grace," Hartley said, with the small, knowing smile that had become familiar over the past 2 weeks. Alaric did not answer that, though he did not deny it either, and Hartley withdrew, leaving his employer alone with his thoughts and the careful, folded letter that had occupied far more of his attention over the past fortnight than any single piece of correspondence had any reasonable right to claim. In the days leading up to Thursday, Alaric found himself thinking often of the conversation in the garden, of the particular honesty Elowen had offered him, an honesty he had not expected, and had not, in truth, offered to anyone himself since his father's death. He had spent 4 years building careful walls around the private grief that lived inside him, walls constructed of duty and reserve and the performance of composure that his position demanded, and in the space of a single conversation, a woman he barely knew had somehow found a way through them, not by force but simply by being honest herself, by offering her own grief without demanding anything in return. He did not fully understand what he wanted from the coming visit, whether it was simply friendship or the continuation of an unusually honest conversation, or something deeper and more significant that he was not yet prepared to name even to himself. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised him given how briefly he had known her, that he did not want the connection between them to end the way it had begun, in an empty chair and an unexplained departure. He wanted, whatever came of it, to understand the woman who had left the ball at 10 and told no one, and to make certain that whatever chair she occupied in whatever room they found themselves in together, he would not be caught unaware by its emptiness again. Thursday arrived cool and bright, with a clear sky that Margaret declared a good omen, though Elowen privately thought her aunt would have found a way to declare almost any weather a good omen given the occasion. The house had been cleaned with unusual thoroughness over the preceding days, the garden hastily trimmed by a boy from the village hired specifically for the task, and Margaret had insisted on a new arrangement of flowers in the front parlor, cut fresh that morning, from what remained of the overgrown beds near the kitchen door. Elowen dressed with more care than she wanted to admit, choosing a simple morning dress in pale blue that Margaret assured her was flattering, without appearing as though she had made any special effort, though the amount of consideration that had gone into achieving that particular impression suggested otherwise. By the time the sound of carriage wheels reached the house shortly after 11, Elowyn's nerves had wound themselves into a state she had not experienced since the earliest days of her presentation into society. Years before Nathaniel's death had changed everything. She watched from the parlor window as the carriage drew to a stop before the house, and felt a small, unexpected flutter of something like joy when Alaric himself stepped down, dressed more simply than she had seen him at the ball, in a dark riding coat that suited the modest surroundings of Ashcombe House far better than the formal attire of that evening had suited him. Margaret answered the door herself, unwilling to trust such an important arrival to the household's single overworked maid, and greeted the Duke with a warmth that bordered on effusive, ushering him into the parlor with an enthusiasm that made Elowyn slightly embarrassed on her aunt's behalf. "Your Grace," Elowyn said, rising to greet him as he entered, and found herself unexpectedly shy, the easy honesty of the garden conversation feeling suddenly more difficult to access in the daylight, in her own home, with Margaret hovering nearby. "Lady Ashcombe," he said, bowing over her hand with a formality that felt, to both of them, slightly performative, given what had passed between them at the ball. "Thank you for allowing me to call. I confess I was uncertain of my welcome, given the delay in writing." "The delay is forgiven," Elowyn said, "provided you have a satisfactory explanation for it. A dispute among my tenant farmers regarding a boundary fence that has apparently been contested for 3 generations, Alaric said, with a rueful smile. "I assure you, it was considerably less interesting than anything discussed in your garden." Margaret, sensing correctly that her presence was no longer strictly necessary, excused herself after a suitable interval to see to refreshments, leaving the two of them alone in the parlor, with a chaperone's absence that would have raised eyebrows in a grander household, but seemed, in the modest, familiar setting of Ashcombe House, simply practical. "Your aunt is delightful," Alaric observed, once Margaret had gone. "My aunt is a force of nature, disguised as a delightful woman," Elowyn said, and was rewarded with the same genuine laugh she had heard from him in the garden, a sound that settled something anxious in her chest. They talked for a long while after that, the conversation ranging easily from the estate disputes that had delayed his letter to the books scattered across the parlor's modest shelves, several of which he recognized and had opinions about, opinions Elowyn found herself disagreeing with in ways that led to a spirited debate about a novel neither of them had expected the other to have read. It was, Elowyn thought, watching him lean forward with genuine enthusiasm as he argued his point, nothing at all like the careful, guarded man she had first observed across the crowded ballroom, and nothing at all like the composed, dutiful Duke the rest of the county seemed to know. "You are different here," she said eventually, echoing, without quite meaning to, the observation he had made of her during their dance. "How do you mean?" "Less careful," she said. "At the ball, even in the garden, there was a certain reserve about you, as though you were measuring each word before you said it. Here you argue about novels as though you have forgotten to measure anything at all." Alaric considered this for a moment, and when he answered, his voice had lost some of its earlier lightness, replaced by something more thoughtful. "I suppose that is true. I have spent 4 years learning to measure everything, Lady Ashcombe. Every word, every expression, every decision, weighed against what the estate requires, what my father would have wanted, what the tenants expect of me, what society demands. It becomes exhausting, after a while, to always be measuring." "And here you do not feel the need to measure?" "Here," he said, meeting her eyes with a directness that made her breath catch slightly. "I find I do not want to. Which is, I confess, a somewhat alarming discovery for a man who has built his entire life around careful measurement." Margaret returned then with a tray of tea and a plate of small cakes, breaking the moment before Elowyn could fully process what he had said, or how she wanted to respond to it, and the conversation shifted to lighter territory, Margaret inserting herself with questions about the state of the roads and the health of the Duke's horses, questions Alaric answered with patient good humor, despite their obvious purpose of simply extending the visit as long as possible. It was during a lull in this conversation, while Margaret had briefly left the room again to fetch more hot water for the tea, that Alaric asked the question he had been turning over in his mind since the ball, unable to fully set it aside despite his best efforts. Might I ask you something about your brother? He said carefully. You need not answer if it is unwelcome. Eowyn was quiet for a moment, but something in his tone, the same careful gentleness she remembered from the garden, made her willing to answer where she might have deflected another. What would you like to know? What happened to him? Alaric said. Only if you wish to tell me. I do not ask out of idle curiosity. Eowyn looked down at her hands, folded in her lap, and took a breath before answering. A fever, she said. It came on suddenly, in the autumn, 2 years ago. He was 3 years older than me, and had always seemed so strong, so certain, that none of us truly believed, even as the doctor's visits grew more frequent, that it could take him. He was gone within a fortnight of first falling ill. She paused, and Alaric waited, sensing there was more, unwilling to rush her toward it. He was meant to inherit everything, of course. Our father had died some years before, and Nathaniel had taken up the responsibilities of the estate with a steadiness I never expected of him, given how carelessly he had lived as a younger man. I think, in some way, losing him felt like losing our whole family a second time, all at once, since so much of what remained of us was tied up in his future plans. And now? Alaric asked gently. What becomes of Ashcombe House, without an heir to inherit it? A distant cousin will inherit the title and the land, eventually, Eowyn said, with a small, tired shrug. My aunt and I have been permitted to remain here for now, out of some sense of family obligation on his part, though I do not know how long that arrangement will last. It is, I think, part of why my aunt is so eager to see me settled. A woman without a home of her own has very few options in this world, however clever or however kind she might be. Alaric absorbed this quietly, something in his expression growing more thoughtful, more careful, as though he were turning over a new understanding of her circumstances that changed the shape of something he had been considering. That is a heavy weight to carry, he said finally. Grief and uncertainty together, with very little room to simply be a person who has lost someone she loved. It is, Eowyn agreed, though I have found, since the ball, that the weight feels somewhat lighter when shared with someone who understands it. Their eyes met, and something passed between them in that quiet moment, unspoken but clearly felt by both, and it was only the sound of Margaret's returning footsteps that broke the connection, both of them straightening slightly, composing themselves back into the ordinary rhythms of a proper afternoon visit, though the air in the room felt, to both of them, subtly and permanently changed. The visit stretched well beyond what propriety strictly required, and by the time Alaric finally rose to take his leave, the afternoon light had begun its slow slide toward evening. He promised to call again the following week, a promise Eowyn accepted with far less hesitation than she had shown at the ball, and as his carriage disappeared down the long drive, she found herself standing at the window for a long while afterward, watching the empty road with a small, private smile she made no effort to hide from Margaret, who watched her with equally undisguised satisfaction. The visits that followed became a steady rhythm over the following weeks, each one deepening the understanding between them, each conversation peeling back another layer of the careful reserve both had built around themselves in the years since their respective losses. Alaric found himself looking forward to Thursdays, with an eagerness he had not felt for anything in years, and Eowyn found the old restlessness that had once driven her to avoid gatherings and hide within the walls of Ashcombe House, slowly, gradually, beginning to ease. It was on one such visit, nearly 2 months after the ball, that Lucy Bramwell arrived unexpectedly at Ashcombe House while Alaric was present, having heard through the ever-efficient channels of county gossip that the Duke's visits had become a regular occurrence, and determined to see the evidence for herself. I simply had to come see it with my own eyes, Lucy announced, settling into the parlor with the easy confidence that had first endeared her to Eowyn at the ball. Half the county is talking of nothing else, you know. The Duke of Renwick, calling on Ashcombe House every week for 2 months. It is the most interesting thing to happen in this corner of the world since old Lord Pettigrew fell into the mill pond chasing his hat. You exaggerate, Eowyn said, though the color rising in her cheeks suggested the exaggeration was not entirely unfounded. I assure you I do not, Lucy said cheerfully, glancing toward Alaric with open curiosity. Your Grace, I hope you do not mind my bluntness, but the entire county is waiting with bated breath to know your intentions. My own mother has speculated on nothing else for a fortnight. Alaric, to his credit, did not appear troubled by the directness of the question, though something in his expression grew more serious, more considered, as he glanced toward Elowen before answering. "My intentions, Miss Bramwell, are to continue calling on Lady Ashcombe for as long as she will permit it, and to see where that continued acquaintance leads, without rushing toward conclusions neither of us are prepared to make prematurely." It was a careful answer, diplomatically phrased, but Elowen caught something in his eyes as he said it, a warmth and a certainty that suggested his private feelings ran considerably deeper than the polite formality of his words. Lucy caught it too, judging by the knowing smile that spread across her face. "Well," Lucy said, "I shall report back to my mother that the matter remains delightfully unresolved, which will no doubt keep the gossip alive for weeks longer, much to everyone's satisfaction." After Lucy departed, promising to visit again soon, and extracting a promise from Elowen to attend an upcoming gathering at the Bramwell estate, Alaric and Elowen found themselves alone again, the earlier lightness of the conversation giving way to something quieter, more introspective. "Does it trouble you?" Elowen asked. "The gossip, I mean. Being spoken of so freely, your private matters discussed at every dinner table in the county." "It troubled me once," Alaric admitted. "In the early years after my father's death, when every decision I made was scrutinized and discussed by people who had never troubled themselves to actually know me, I learned, eventually, to care less about what was said and more about what was true." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "What troubles me now is not the gossip itself, but the possibility that it might trouble you, that it might make you feel exposed in ways you are not prepared for, given how carefully you have guarded yourself these past 2 years." Elowen considered this, surprised, as she often was with him, by the thoughtfulness of his concern, the way he seemed to anticipate the shape of her worries before she had fully articulated them herself. "I confess it is strange," she said slowly, "to have spent so long avoiding notice, avoiding the questions, and the careful, curious glances of people who thought they understood my grief, simply because they had heard its outline, and now to find myself the subject of exactly the kind of attention I spent 2 years fleeing." She paused, considering further. "But it is different now, somehow. Perhaps because the attention comes attached to something I actually want, rather than something forced upon me by circumstance." "That is a generous way of framing it," Alaric said, "though I confess I would understand entirely if the attention became too much, if you needed to step back from it." "I do not think I will," Elowen said, and found, as she said it, that she meant it fully. A certainty settling into her chest that surprised her with its steadiness. 2 years ago, I do not think I could have managed this. The visits, the gossip, the county watching and speculating. But something has changed these past months. I find I do not want to hide the way I once did." Alaric reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, a gesture that felt, in the quiet privacy of the parlor, more significant than any formal declaration might have been. "I am glad," he said simply. "Though I confess I have grown rather fond of the version of you I met in the garden that night, careful and guarded as she was. I would not want you to think that changing, for my sake or anyone else's, is required of you." "I am not changing for your sake," Elowen said, meeting his eyes steadily. "I am simply remembering, I think, what it felt like to want things again, rather than merely enduring them. And I find, rather to my own surprise, that I want a great many things now that I did not think myself capable of wanting only a few months ago." The moment held between them, quiet and charged, until the sound of Margaret's approaching footsteps once again interrupted the intimacy of it, and they drew apart with the practiced ease of two people, growing accustomed to the constant possibility of interruption in a small household. But something had shifted between them in that exchange, a certainty settling into place that neither of them fully voiced aloud, though both understood, without needing the words, that whatever had begun in the garden on the night of the ball had grown, over 2 months of Thursday visits, into something neither of them was prepared to walk away from. Autumn arrived slowly over the following weeks, the leaves along the drive at Ashcombe House turning gold and then brown, the air carrying the first sharp edges of the coming winter. Alaric's visits continued without interruption, and though neither of them spoke openly of what everyone in the county had already concluded, a quiet understanding had settled between them, steady and certain, needing no grand declaration to confirm what both already knew to be true. It was on a Thursday, much like all the others, though the sky hung heavier with clouds than usual, and the wind carried the promise of an early frost, that Alaric arrived at Ashcombe House with a different bearing than she had grown used to, a nervous energy beneath his usual composure that Eowyn noticed the moment he stepped from the carriage. "You seem troubled," she said, once they were settled in the parlor, Margaret having tactfully withdrawn to the kitchen on some invented errand that fooled neither of them. "Not troubled," Alaric said, though his hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady as he set aside his hat. "Only uncertain how best to say something I have been turning over in my mind for some weeks now." Eowyn felt her own heart quicken, some instinct already anticipating the shape of what was coming, though she said nothing, waiting, giving him the space to find his words in his own time, the way he had once given her that space in the darkness of his garden. "I have thought a great deal," Alaric said finally, "about that first evening, about the empty chair I found when I returned to look for you. I did not understand, at the time, why it troubled me as much as it did. I told myself it was simple concern for a guest, nothing more, though I suspect some part of me knew even then that it was already something considerably more than that." He rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her in a gesture that made her breath catch, her hands trembling slightly as he took them in his own. "I do not want to spend the rest of my life wondering whether your chair will be empty," he said, his voice low and steady despite the visible emotion beneath it. "I do not want to watch you slip away into gardens and shadows, carrying your grief alone, when I have spent these past months learning that grief carried together is somehow lighter than grief carried apart. I love you, Eowyn Ashcombe. I have loved you, I think, since that first dance, though it has taken me these months to understand it fully, and to find the courage to say it plainly." He paused, drawing a small breath before continuing. "I am asking you to marry me. Not because it would please the county, or ease my aunt's constant matchmaking schemes, or fill the empty rooms of Renwick House, though it would certainly do all of those things. I am asking because I cannot imagine a room, any room, that would not feel emptier for your absence from it." Eowyn felt tears gathering, unexpected and unstoppable, and found herself laughing softly through them, an emotion too large and too complicated to be contained by any single expression. She asked, though the question carried none of the old caution, only a kind of wondering disbelief that such certainty could exist for her, after everything. "More certain than I have been of anything, since the day I inherited this title I never asked for," Alaric said. "You have given me back something I thought I had lost entirely, the day my father died. Not simply happiness, though you have given me that too, but the courage to feel things fully again, without measuring every word, without building walls to keep the world at a careful distance. I would like to spend the rest of my life learning to feel things that fully beside you, if you will let me." "Yes," Eowyn said, the word emerging, before she had fully finished processing the question, a certainty rising in her chest that felt, after 2 years of careful guardedness, like the first true breath she had taken in a very long time. "Yes, I will marry you." Alaric rose and drew her into an embrace that felt, to both of them, like the culmination of everything that had passed between them since that first dance. The careful conversation in the garden, the months of Thursday visits, the slow, steady rebuilding of two hearts that had each learned, separately, how to survive loss without ever quite learning how to live fully again until they found each other. Margaret, who had been listening rather less discreetly than she believed from just outside the parlor door, entered a few moments later with an expression of such undisguised delight that neither of them bothered to pretend she had not overheard everything. "Well," she said, dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her apron, "it is about time. I have been arranging flowers for 2 months in anticipation of exactly this moment." The wedding took place the following spring in the small chapel on the Renwick estate, attended by the entire county, and presided over by a vicar who had known Alaric since his childhood, and who spoke, in his address, of the particular grace found in two grieving hearts, finding their way back to joy together. Lucy Bramwell stood beside Eowyn, as she had promised she would, and Hartley, standing near the back of the chapel with unusual sentiment visible on his normally composed face, remarked to no one in particular that he had never seen his employer look so entirely, unguardedly happy. That evening, At the wedding celebration held in the great ballroom where they had first met, Elowen found herself once again seated near the edge of the dance floor as the hour grew late. Though this time, the familiar dread did not rise within her as the clock crept toward 10. Alaric found her there, as he always seemed to find her now, and settled into the chair beside her rather than across the room, his hand finding hers without needing to be asked. "No garden tonight?" he asked, with a small, knowing smile. "I do not think I need it," Elowen said, watching the dancers move through the candlelit room, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, entirely present in the moment, rather than braced against some old, familiar sorrow. "Grief still visits, sometimes, at strange hours. I do not think that will ever fully change, but I find I no longer need to face it alone, or hide it from the people who might understand." "No," Alaric agreed, drawing her hand to his lips. "Never alone again, if I have anything to say about it." The clock struck 10 somewhere in the great house, its chimes carrying faintly through the music and the laughter, and for the first time in 2 years, Elowen did not feel the old urge to rise quietly from her chair and slip away unnoticed into the night. She remained exactly where she was, her hand held securely in her husband's, watching the candlelight flicker across the faces of the people who had gathered to celebrate them, and understood, with a certainty that settled deep and warm in her chest, that whatever hours the future held, difficult or joyful, she would not need to face them from an empty chair again.